How did we go from this to this? Well, what if I told you that the evolution of Souls games was not only natural, but something that has to happen? To explain why, let's start at the very beginning, with Demon's Souls. Now, when you look at Demon's Souls, which I'm going to use remake footage because I simply don't have a way to record on my PlayStation 3, what I find the most interesting is the fact that the base combat actually is almost identical to Dark Souls 1. In fact, it's almost identical to Dark Souls 3. Like, look at this. What Demon's Souls, however, lacks is any real depth to its gameplay or boss design. The core enemies and level design is very similar to the later games, but when you look at what the big bosses are, a lot of them are either gimmicks or painfully easy, and if any of them are hard, chances are good you're just there underleveled. There are only 3 or maybe 4 bosses in that entire game that would be eligible for boss status in the later titles. Those being False King, Flame Lurker, Penetrator, and maybe Man-Eaters, although the rest of these fights just don't hold up. So when it came time to make Dark Souls 1, the direction that they were going to take the game in was obvious. Well, we've got a working combat system, let's actually use it. And this is where they first started really expanding on the Souls-like combat formula. Taking the feedback that False King was the best fight in the game, there are many fights in Dark Souls that are reminiscent of it. On top of that, enemies by and large are more aggressive, they optimized healing items so that they're never a thing you need to farm for, and overall the game feels a lot more fun. They really started finding a rhythm here. It still feels very clunky by modern standards, but when you go back to Dark Souls, the game still has charm. I'd even say it does some things better than the later series. While gathering footage, I was walking through the Darkroot Basin, and it's genuinely eerie. I was on a character who's completely overpowered for this area, and I still felt uncomfortable just because the silence and the fog make for an atmosphere that's way stronger than anything you really find in later titles. Looking at the bosses though, there are standouts like Artorias, but even he doesn't really push the combat to the limit. And what is Souls combat? Well, it's based on rolling. Unlike some other games with big bosses, a lot of the bosses in Dark Souls are built around the idea that their attacks are going to track you well enough to force you to roll, and after you've rolled through their chain, you're going to have an opening to hit them. But they were still finding their stride. There's a very clear lack of polish here. Even the fight with Artorias, something that was lauded as one of the best bosses ever at the time, really doesn't hold up to modern standards. And going back now from Elden Ring, the roll feels way clunkier, the weapons are slower, trying to heal mid-fight requires completely stopping. It's just overall not as good feeling of a game. And Artorias himself only has like 8 moves, a jump, his iconic flip, and a couple of regular sword swings. Don't get me wrong, it's more than enough for him to be fun, but it just doesn't really hook me. Dark Souls 1 is also much more experimental with the gimmicks. It's not as blatant as Demon's Souls, where there was almost always one right answer to the fights, but the fights themselves have some wild disparity in polish and fun. The same game that gave us Artorias also gave us Capra Demon and Pinwheel. It stands out. But what was the feedback for Dark Souls 1? Well, the game felt a lot better, and the open, interconnected world was a major hit, but people still felt like Artorias was the big standout, and a lot of the bosses just weren't received very well. It also suffered majorly from a rushed development cycle, with certain areas being completely unfinished, such as Tomb of the Giants and do I even need to mention Lost Izalith. Overall, it was still a big jump from Demon's Souls, but it was also lacking. And that leads us to Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 is the peak of Fromsoft boss design. There are better individual fights in Elden Ring, but I'd say the quality of Dark Souls 3 is higher than anything else. It's my favorite game of all time. I've put thousands of hours into it. And I still can go back and run the final bosses and have a great time. In Dark Souls 3, they've way upped the responsiveness of the player character. Even though actions still take roughly the same time, they feel so much better. You can move and heal. Healing is quicker. Your attacks have chains to them where multiple swings have slightly different animations. Nothing crazy, but it feels more polished. And the roll just feels more responsive as well. It still takes about the same amount of time, but it just feels better. Dark Souls 3 has bosses for everyone. There's Osiris, there's Nameless King, there's Udic Skundir, there's Soul of Cinder, there's Gale, there's Midir even. I know a lot of people don't like Midir, but look at Midir. He is a perfect example of a good Souls boss, in that all of his attacks can be rolled through, and he's got a clear indicator of when he's open. Do you see this little head tilt animation? Yeah. If you ever see that, you are safe to go hit him. I think Midir is incredible. He just hits really hard. Also with Midir, when you finally do get to finish him off, he's almost guaranteed to die to a critical hit. This isn't a scripted event, it's just a damage to the head threshold. But most of the time, if you're using an upgraded weapon and you're of level, this critical hit is going to finish him off, because they gave it a massive damage modifier. Oh, this fight is just so satisfying. But looking at Dark Souls 3 now, we can finally clearly identify the limiting factor behind Fromsoft boss design. And that's the roll. What do I mean by that? When you're designing your bosses around one specific defensive mechanic, there's a rule you kind of are forced to follow to make those bosses feel good. In this case, it's pretty simple. You can't give any bosses attack chains that force the player to dodge them faster than they can dodge. What that means is that every single boss in Dark Souls 3, if you map out their attacks, will never attack faster than you can consecutively roll. This means that every single boss will have some combination of attacking as quickly as you can roll and delaying to force you to vary your timing. Unless you speed up the player's roll, that also hard limits how quickly your enemies can attack. They play around with this a little. There are some specific bosses that come to mind, such as Dancer or Gale, that will attack slightly faster than you can roll, but even then, if you dodge with the later half of your iframes, you can still roll through it. Or the occasional move that requires rolling in a specific direction in order to avoid it. But for the most part, at Dark Souls 3, they were pushing the upper limit of what this combat system could do. Once you hit that limit, what comes next? How do you make a fun, compelling game in a series that's known for its difficulty when you're already hitting the limit of what your combat system can do? Well, in Elden Ring, they kind of sidestep that limitation. Elden Ring focuses much less on high-quality boss fights through and through, and instead pushes the RPG aspect. If you don't have a good build in Elden Ring, the game is so much harder. And on the other hand, if you go out of your way to make a good build, you can be incredibly strong even at level 1. And they save the difficulty for very specific bosses. Sure, you've got Morgott or Margit, who honestly fights like a stereotypical Dark Souls 3 encounter, but then you also have Melania, whose waterfall dance is a perfect example of pushing the positional element of rolling to the extreme. Now not only do you have to time your roll, but if you don't roll in a specific way, this attack will still kill you. And then finally, no spoilers in case someone still is working through this somehow, but in Shadow of the Erdtree, the final boss pushes everything to the utmost limit. I don't think you can design a harder, fair Fromsoft fight. You need to roll properly. You need to move properly. It mixes jumping, sprinting, and rolling. Every defensive option that the game gave you has to be used here. So where do we go from here? Well, if you're not going to add any new defensive mechanics, there's only one real thing you can do. Make the player character stronger. That's why their newest game, Night Rain, is pushing crazy character-specific effects, because unless they add new defensive mechanics, they really can't do more. And Fromsoft knows this too. Take a look at Sekiro. In Sekiro, they made an entirely new defensive system that still has the rhythm elements of Souls combat, but now is untethered from roll speed. But knowing that the deflect system, on its own, could have had the same stagnation issue they were running into with the Souls formula, they also implemented attacks that can't be deflected. This allows for a whole new element of mechanical play to open up. Other games using the stamina-based dodge attack system have been doing something similar. For instance, take a look at Black Myth Wukong. Here they use perfect dodges and extra character abilities to make the game feel interesting. What I'm saying is, most likely, Elden Ring is the last of the true Souls games that we're going to get. If we do get another one, it's either going to have new defensive mechanics to master, or it's going to be absolutely crazy on the abilities, and play out much more like an RPG where you become overpowered than even Elden Ring, with the core Souls combat serving more as a vehicle for them to build all of their crazy effects on top of. At least, that's the future that I see for these games. Most likely, I don't think Fromsoft is going to want to keep retreading this same ground. So if we are going to see a new Souls-like from them, in my opinion, Night Rain is a great glimpse at what you can expect. Anyway, I think that about sums up what I wanted to say. I tried a new style with this video where I didn't fully script everything, and instead I kind of made little bullet points just to remind myself of what I wanted to say. So let me know what you think of the presentation on this video. I'm really curious how it was. I'll probably still do full scripted videos, especially for things like satire where for a joke to hit, your timing needs to be correct. But if I'm going to be serious about doing YouTube, I want to be able to do videos in a decent time span, and fully scripted videos just take so much longer. But yeah, I love feedback, and I always try to listen, especially if it's relevant. Even if you do it as a flame, go ahead. I got a lot of complaints about my mic early on. And I mean, I listened. I set up a whole mini sound booth in my office because of it. And ever since, I feel my mic quality's been better. So yeah, I'm always looking to improve. This particular design video is one I've wanted to do for a while. Next up, I have two ideas. I want to do either something on Black Myth Wukong, which is going to be kind of more funny, not really as much of a breakdown, but the other idea that I have is a Night Rain video. I might actually go make that now that I think about it. Night Rain is a really nice game for making content for because the runs are 40 minutes. So if you want to do something, it's not like doing a challenge in Elden Ring where you could be working on it for hundreds of hours. Like, subscribe, it's up to you, but I appreciate the support. And until next time, see ya.